In 1916, a ship considered safer than the Titanic sank in less than an hour. Marked as a hospital ship, Britannic sailed under international protection and was still destroyed. What happened in that seemingly calm stretch of the Aegean Sea raises questions to this day. An unseen explosion, critical decisions, and fatal errors sealed the fate of the largest hospital ship ever built. Before we break down, minute by minute, how Britannic vanished so quickly, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow this historical investigation to the very end. Britannic was built as a luxury ocean liner, part of the Olympic class, designed to dominate the Atlantic. After the Titanic disaster, her design was upgraded with additional lifeboats and reinforced compartments. When World War I erupted, the ship was requisitioned by the British Admiralty. Converted into a hospital ship, she was sent to operate in the Eastern Mediterranean. By November 1916, Britannic was sailing the Aegean Sea on a routine medical mission. As the war intensified, Britannic underwent a full medical conversion. Passenger spaces became wards, filled with hundreds of beds and triage areas. The ship now carried doctors, nurses, and surgical supplies instead of tourists. Though protected by international conventions, the Mediterranean was a dangerous theater. German submarines operated throughout the region, turning every crossing into a calculated risk. On the morning of November 21, 1916, Britannic was heading toward Lemnos to collect wounded soldiers. The sky was clear, the sea was calm. The crew maintained steady speed, confident in the ship's enhanced safety systems. But weeks earlier, this section of the Aegean had been mined. The danger wasn't on the horizon, it was hidden beneath the water. At 8:12 a.m., a violent explosion tore into Britannic's starboard side. The ship is believed to have struck a German naval mine. The blast wasn't seen, but it was felt throughout the hull. Bulkheads shuddered, objects flew. The quiet of the hospital wards vanished in seconds. Britannic began to list, a clear sign that something had gone terribly wrong. The explosion ripped open the hull below the waterline, allowing seawater to rush into the forward compartments. Watertight doors were activated, but not all of them could stop the flooding. Britannic was still moving ahead, forcing water deeper into the ship. Within minutes, the list became impossible to ignore. The situation was unfolding faster than the safety calculations had ever predicted. As Britannic approached the mined area, other parts of the ship continued as if nothing had changed. Hospital wards operated normally, corridors remained open, crew and medical staff moved freely. Ventilation protocols kept portholes open for comfort. These practical decisions, common on medical missions, seemed harmless at the time. Minutes later, they would prove disastrous. To maintain comfort and efficiency, many portholes across the ship remained open. Watertight doors were crossed repeatedly, some left unsecured. Natural ventilation took priority over full isolation. Under normal conditions, these practices followed protocol, but when the hull was breached, they became pathways that accelerated the spread of water. Even after the initial blast, not every section of Britannic immediately grasped the severity of the damage. In some areas, routine continued for brief moments as the list slowly increased. Equipment began to slide, liquids ran across the floors, the sense of stability vanished. The shift from normal operations to full emergency was sudden and irreversible. On the upper decks, ventilation portholes remained open, standard practice on hospital ships. Corridors were kept clear for stretchers and supply carts. Service doors stayed unlocked to speed up work. In normal conditions, this improved efficiency. But with damage below the waterline, every opening became a route for water and smoke to spread. With the ship in constant operation, movement was non-stop and internal routes stayed open by design. Doors and vents were treated as routine details. That mindset helps explain why, once the damage occurred, water found unexpected paths. If you want to see how every minute of the sinking fits together, like the video and subscribe to follow the full sequence. At 8:12 a.m., a sudden explosion rocked Britannic on her starboard side. The detonation occurred below the waterline, most likely caused by a naval mine. The shockwave traveled through the hull like solid force, making the entire ship vibrate. Order gave way to confusion. Many on board didn't know what had happened, only that something was terribly wrong. The initial shock was followed by the deep sound of metal tearing apart. Near the bow, people were thrown to the floor. Objects shattered, dust and steam filled lower corridors. The list became more pronounced, and the first injuries appeared. For many, this was the moment it became clear this was no minor incident. In the minutes after the blast, the priority shifted to understanding the damage. Officers were dispatched to inspect compartments and report flooding. On the bridge, orders were issued to reduce speed and contain the water. Information arrived in fragments. The ship's survival now depended on decisions made under extreme pressure. As reports reached the bridge, the picture grew grim. Multiple forward compartments were compromised and water was advancing beyond design limits. Watertight doors failed to contain the flooding as intended. Course and engine adjustments made little difference. The list kept increasing. It became clear Britannic would not stay afloat much longer. With the bow sinking lower, water began crossing boundaries meant only for worst-case scenarios. Forward compartments filled rapidly. Dry corridors turned into sloping channels. Doors designed to stop flooding no longer sealed properly. The ship's forward motion worsened the situation, pushing water deeper inside. Time was now working against Britannic. As flooding spread, emergency systems began to fail. Watertight doors no longer sealed completely, and the growing list forced water between decks. The ship, still moving, drove the flood into areas once considered safe. Every lost minute multiplied the damage. Control was no longer local. It affected the entire forward hull. With flooding out of control, attention turned to evacuation. Orders circulated to prepare lifeboats as the list made the decks harder to cross. Discipline still held, but cracks were forming. The sea remained calm, a dangerous contrast to the growing urgency on board. With the ship still moving, evacuation became more complex than expected. The list made lifeboats difficult to launch, and haste led to rushed decisions. Not everyone waited for clear orders. In some areas, coordination broke down. The calm sea created a false sense of control. As the angle increased, maintaining order became harder. Some lifeboats were prepared without full coordination, while the slick deck slowed movement. The ship continued moving forward, increasing the danger. The sea stayed calm, but the mix of haste, angle, and mistimed decisions made every action riskier. During evacuation, some lifeboats were launched while Britannic was still making way. Water rushing along the hull created a powerful current. What should have been a safe escape became a new threat. The danger no longer came only from sinking, but from trying to flee it. With the ship still moving, the propellers continued spinning beneath the surface. The current along the hull pulled boats and debris toward the stern. The danger was immediate and invisible to many on deck. In moments, evacuation shifted from a controlled operation to a high-risk struggle where every decision had to be reconsidered. Attempts to halt evacuation came too late in some areas. Lifeboats were already in the water, pushed into dangerous positions by the current. As the list increased, isolated actions began to dictate events. Coordination fractured. The effort to save lives became reactive, adjusting to threats that changed by the second. As the list grew rapidly, centralized control was nearly lost. Individual actions replaced coordinated orders. People were already in the water, and rescues happened on the fly, guided by proximity rather than plan. The deck became unstable. Loose objects turned every movement into added danger. With the bow completely submerged, Britannic entered an irreversible descent. The angle increased sharply, lifting the stern high above the sea. Water rushed inward, creating powerful suction around the hull. Those still nearby understood the truth. Time had run out. The ship was about to vanish. Within minutes, the stern was swallowed as well. Britannic vanished beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea with shocking speed. Where a hospital giant once stood, only whirlpools, debris, and silence remained. The entire sinking took less than an hour. For survivors, the shock came not just from the speed, but from the sudden quiet that followed. Hours later, the sea had returned to calm. Hundreds of feet below, Britannic rested almost intact, preserving the scars of the explosion and the decisions made in critical minutes. The largest hospital ship in the world became a silent witness to modern warfare, a ship built to save lives, lost in less than an hour and remembered ever since.